Hey guys, thanks for tuning into this episode about current race relations in the United States. I just wanted to give you guys a quick update that the sentence for the murderers of George Floyd has been updated to a second-degree charge, and we didn't know that in the video, so just be aware of that. I hope you guys enjoy the episode, and I hope you stick around for part 2. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our political podcast, Base. Today we will be talking about race relations, and we want to make it really easy for you guys to follow along with the debate. So the first thing we'll be talking about is the direct response to the George Floyd case. Secondly, we'll be talking about the presence of discrimination, generational economic disparity, and police brutality among Black people. Third, we will be talking about steps forward and solutions. So we'll be talking about, well, should we be protesting violently or peacefully? And we can get into some specific policy measures and discuss what legislation needs to be proposed in order to structurally change police staffing and procedure. All right, so we'll also be having another guest joining us, so do not be alarmed when he joins. He is not a terrorist.
You might want to be alarmed, though.
Right. He's not going to attack you.
He's pretty ugly. He's unsightly. You might be surprised at just how.
Mine will change when you see his calves. So, okay, we're going to get into the first point of discussion: the direct response to George Floyd.
The response in terms of the protest, or the response in terms of how the government.
I think we're starting in
like we're talking about arrest.
Yeah, just we can talk.
Well, I think
about the case and the murder.
Okay, so I think we can first agree that the cop was clearly in the wrong and should be arrested, along with the 3 or 4 others that were involved in the murder of George Floyd. Now, in terms of what the cop should be charged with is, kind of debatable, just because a new autopsy came out that it wasn't just the kneeling on his neck that caused him to die. It wasn't him being suffocated that was his death. It was a heart related trauma, along with the alcohol in his system. However, it is, that's, the stress that comes from, coming from a cop, kneeling on your neck did contribute. It's known that it did contribute to that. So I think
it triggered it. What?
Well,
no, the fact that when a guy passes out, they don't do anything. Like
that was another.
Drinking alcohol
laying on the floor, and you're like,
Hayden, I may have misspoke. I completely agree with you on the fact that it was the cops' response. What he did was what led to the death of George Floyd.
And just to clarify, also on the whole autopsy thing, people who do autopsies get paid from the same people who are cops. So just to add autopsies are famously sort of inconclusive when it comes to police brutality.
Okay, if you want, okay. Well, then if you want,
that there was
that's just speculation.
Okay, then let's.
Right. Well, do we want to get into the specifics of the case, because he was charged with third-degree murder, which is only a legal definition in a few states in the United States, and that definition is committing an act of violence by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind without regard for life and without intent to kill. So I think that is a fair charge. It should be third-degree murder. He didn't intend to kill George Floyd, but he should still be charged with murder. I hope he gets locked in prison for the rest of his life and does not get to re-enter society.
He probably won't be if it's third degree. The punishments aren't life sentences at all.
But Hayden, I'd also like to respond to that, just because I want to make everyone aware. There's another reason for charging him with the third degree, and the reason being that if they charged him with second or first degree, they wouldn't be allowed to charge him with third degree after that. Then they'd have, if they couldn't prove it that he had an intent to kill George Floyd for second degree, let's just say, then they would be forced to go with manslaughter. So that would be even less than third degree. So now that's a problem of convincing the jury that he had an intent to kill George Floyd, and that's where problems come about. So I think if you want a decent sentence and you want it almost guaranteed that it happens, I would think you would want to go with third degree, because you can't always predict what a jury would respond to. So
right, which I see part of the problem, right? I mean, if you once you
that would
video, for me, it's second degree. It's generally defined. Secondary is generally defined as intentional murder, lacking premeditation, and it doesn't have to be intentional murder, meaning it is intended to cause bodily harm and demonstrates an extreme indifference to human life. And depending on how you look at the timetables, there is an argument to be made that it is first degree, because if you look, there's cam footage outside of the storefront, which a lot of cam footage was taken from, that actually shows that they were beating him inside the car before they took him outside, right? Like they were there. It's unclear, the video footage, which makes it kind of up in the air, right? But there's a clear struggle as he's bent over backwards into the car, and the police looks like he's physically berating him. And then when you look at how long he had his knee on George Floyd's neck, intending to cause bodily harm, knowing that isn't a practice used by police officers, right? That's not
correct. Yeah,
it should be. I genuinely believe that there is an argument for first degree, and if I was on the jury and someone presented me with the case, and unless there was some substantive evidence that is not been brought to light so far, which I doubt there is. Terracus.
Okay, so I'll be introducing our next guest. We have Terry Wangster on here. It's his real name is Terry Wang. He had his own podcast before ours. It was called Immature Politics. He did it with another student named Cooper Smith, who may join us another night, but tonight we'll just have Terry Wang on.
It's pretty incredible.
He's definitely based. Terry,
if you want to give like a little background of your political beliefs, not too long, maybe like a minute, just go ahead.
Yeah, we all did the political compass on camera, Terry, so you should probably give them a little.
Well, I am happy to reveal my coordinates for the political compass. Yeah, let me just pull it up. I believe I was, I want to say
bottom left. Say bottom left.
No.
Economic is negative 3.5. Social, and on the social scale, it's negative 4.77.
So you were bottom left, but just barely?
I mean, in a sense, kind of almost barely. I'm more leaning towards the center than towards the middle.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, you were in the green quadrant, right?
I am in the green quadrant. Yes.
It's all that matters to me.
So libertarian left centrist, so kind of cringe.
Well,
okay.
Nathan, you say everything is cringe though. That doesn't really count.
I believe that.
But I think I'm the final judge on cringe and based. Like I think I'm the judge, jury, and executioner.
Also, legality is morality, so
That's not necessarily true. I think legality can determine morality, but not necessarily what's going on.
You envision a society in which it is, but we got to get back to the point.
Okay, so
my point was, hold on, let me finish my thought. My point was that if I was on the jury and the case was effectively argued in the way that I think it is laid out, I would probably say it's first degree murder. I understand politically why you would charge third degree, absolutely, but when you look at the premeditation, you look at the definition of a first degree murder, I think it's no question second degree, and it's definitely first. And I think it's kind of disappointing that the justice system is clouded by the justice system is clouded by the fact that we need to prove third degree just to get him arrested, just to virtue signal to the fact that, he was charged with murder, right? It feels a little, it's combining politics and the law. And
well, okay, in response to that.
Also said multiple times that he could not breathe.
Right.
Yes.
It was on his neck, and this is a police officer that has a history of violence. 100% I'm okay with him being charged for first degree murder. In response, third degree murder thing, he did have an intent to kill.
Right, and it doesn't. The intent to kill also can be
murder. I think that's pretty ridiculous because, and I mean, it can obviously fit under the second-degree murder. Obviously, this is a weird case because it's in Minnesota and they have this third-degree murder system, but it's just ridiculous. He murdered George Floyd and he wanted to do it.
Right.
Okay, and then I would like to also add that, like Ben was saying, he said he couldn't breathe was one thing, and then it was also acknowledged by the people that were filming that he was unconscious for, I believe it was like 2 minutes and 30 seconds with the officer's knees still on his neck. So that can go into like evidence about whether or not he had a intention to kill or cause bodily harm, because obviously the man was not resisting at that point if he was unconscious and was continuing to keep his knee on top of George Floyd. And also, there was other information. It's unconfirmed by big news sources. However, there is some speculation regarding previous encounters between these two, specifically George Floyd and the cop that is responsible for the murder. I believe there was some evidence that pointed towards that they worked together, as George Floyd was the security and the officer was like an off-duty cop that was a part of the same thing. So that could be a problem, and could also go with the premeditation part if there was some, hate that was involved between the two. If that could be proven, that could be something that could be that could be monumental if that was proven to a first-degree charge. If that
and the riots that would just cause, I mean, further in the violence. I mean, that would be a pretty substantial turn in the case.
Right. So also,
well, I don't know if that would cause more. I don't know if that would cause more riots necessarily. I think it would, because I think people would be angry, but I think if the justice system and the people charging the officer were to acknowledge that, like, immediately after that was found out, I think it would almost benefit the rioters, the protesters, and, the people that think that, the cop should be in jail, because they could all unite behind the fact that if there was some previous premeditation, that we can unite behind that, and so could the justice system. I think that would be beneficial to stopping riots, protests, and what's going on right now.
Right. So Nathan, you talked about we can unite around something. Trump even acknowledged on Twitter that the murderer of George Floyd is guilty, and a lot of people don't think that's sufficient because he's calling in the National Guard to stop protests. But around America, this case is pretty much settled, and there is no one, even conservatives, even far-right people, not denouncing what the murderer did. That's good that we can start on that basis of agreement, but some people want people to go farther on the right and denounce all police brutality and introduce major legislative reform.
Yeah, so I think that could lead us into our next topic. So
yep, now we can talk about the presence of discrimination, generational economic disparity, and police brutality, most importantly, among the Black community. So we're just talking about if it exists, and then from there we'll go on and talk about what we can do moving forward.
I mean, if I'll go in first. The fact that people are still debating on whether or not it still exists, I mean, unless you're like Caitlin Bennett and you're, a clinical, whatever. But the fact that people are still debating whether or not it exists, I find is absolutely ridiculous. And I find the funny part is people say, oh, well, it existed then, right? It existed way back then. But now, no. Well, here's the misunderstanding of the case. If it existed then it set into motion a system of discrimination which continues its effects until today and will not be ratified until we make substantive change, whether that be legislatively or socially, or even economically. It will continue until this day, until we, find justice, right? A lot of people say, oh, justice. So not social justice, well, the thing about social justice is, where is the justice for, slaves, right? There was no justice ever for that. And without retribution, that system continues until this day, right? Jim Crow, no retribution. You see all of these systemic problems that occur over and over and over again. You can say, oh, well, I don't think it's, either it's not as bad now or it's solved now. But that's not the actual issue. The actual issue is that it happened then and continues its effects until now.
So what do you propose?
Yeah, exactly. I think the issue is what would you do in order to solve what
I don't think many people really dispute the fact that African Americans are disadvantaged. It's more so like, what is the proper course of action?
Right. So, being, a libertarian leftist, it's an interesting thing, because I believe that in order to have a society, you have to regulate it somehow, right? And if the axis of regulation is you can either regulate it economically or you can regulate it socially, I don't think it's even a question. The morally correct thing to do is to regulate it economically, right? And the most measured way that you could bring about such change would be to do it economically. And trying to bring about change socially is traditionally much more stubborn ordeal. It's a really difficult thing to accomplish, versus a lot of people are against reparations, right? Reparations. Oh, well, that's not. I understand the issue with reparations. However, the stability of the American economy isn't really volatile, right? So
the American economy is super volatile.
Hold on.
Like
volatile in the fact that it's volatile by the systems in which it is predicated on, right? The free market. But when I say, if you were to sit here and bring about reparations, not all at once, but through some sort of stimulus stretched out over time, through maybe like a wealth tax like Senator Warren proposed in the debate, maybe something akin to a AI integration, AI usage tax, right? Like Andrew Yang was supporting, where you take a percentage of every interaction economically that is made with AI.
So just raise taxes in some way.
Right. And I don't think that that's necessarily difficult. A lot of people say, well, it's not going to work out the way you think it is. And I understand that it's not going to be a catch-all, save-all problem. But the fact of the matter is if you provide that sort of stimulus in large part to a Black community that has been economically disadvantaged and hit with layers upon layers of, not only slavery, Jim Crow, but economic problems, right? You think of the GI subsidization of suburban America. People were coming back from World War II. It's a historic fact that Black veterans from World War II weren't given the same GI benefits as white Americans were. And as suburban expansion continued and money was pulled out of the inner cities, that economic problem still persists until this day, based on the racism which essentially came from slavery. But I've been talking for 5 fucking minutes, so you guys go ahead.
The one main problem that I would see in your argument, and I agree with you in large part, and I think the main problem when we come to acknowledging, in concern to acknowledging the issue in the first place, is the moderates and the people that don't speak out and ignore the prevalence of the actual issue itself, because it is in large part present in America. I mean, there are implicit biases, there's discrimination, all of that. And you can say, well, okay, the United States of America is the best place on earth and we've overcome so much, but there's so much more to do. So Hayden, what I would say is, should it really be based solely on race? Because so many African Americans luckily have lifted themselves out of poverty. So shouldn't we just be focusing it more economically, redistributing that wealth, or should it just be reparations and we should just make it Black people? I mean, that's one of the problems some people have with affirmative action, is it just judges people based on the color of their skin and not their socioeconomic standing.
Right. No, I truly believe that it should be African American people, and I say African American distinctly because I do not mean African people. Right. If you can trace your lineage back, let's say your grandfather immigrated here from Ethiopia, right? Well, then you weren't really affected by the system. I mean, you're affected by the systemic racism today, but not to the same effect that someone who, was their ancestors were literally like carted over from a slave ship, right? So I would be in support of actually narrowing the economic stimulus to the point where if you can trace if you can trace back, or maybe if you cannot trace back your lineage, which is, its own problem. Anyway, but I would be in favor of it being black, because even if you are a rich black person, right, the hurdles in which you had to climb over to reach that position were far greater than a white person, and that is evidenced by the fact of the far fewer numbers of African American people who are within the top income bracket, right? And so you say, rich people don't really need it. That's not the issue. The issue isn't whether you need it. The issue is solving the injustice in some tangible way, which was committed years and years and years ago, right? So it is solving an injustice. Whether or not it is functionally solving the issue is sort of regardless to the point and regardless to the actual argument of why we need reparations anyway. Reparations is, think of it more of a justice being solved than a socialist policy, right?
But Hayden, in response to that, you were talking about even the rich African Americans that can trace their can't trace their lineage back to the point in which their ancestors were brought over here. But you also talked about they had hurdles to climb in which they got to where they are. For example, more wealthier African Americans. Well, in terms of as time progresses, and if you still want to implement the system in 10 years if it's not already implemented, correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if in terms of that, for example, how would you deal with the children of already wealthy or wealthy grandparents that are of African American descent? How would you deal with those?
Do you mean like mixed race people or?
No, I mean, like, for example, if this policy wasn't implemented for the next 10, 20 years, if we're doing something specific, for example, LeBron James, we can all acknowledge LeBron James has some hurdles to climb as he's got his way, he made his way. But for example, his children or his grandchildren, would they also be entitled to the same benefits if, for example, LeBron James's lineage can be traced or can't be traced back to that point?
Well, yes, because racism has affected people generationally, right? When you look at all of the studies, I can cite evidence if you guys want me to, if anyone has a challenge to that. But my point is that, when you're born into poverty, you are set with a very exclusive number of I called them hurdles before, so we'll call them hurdles this time. It's hurdles and hoops you have to jump through. And generationally, maybe you weren't affected by slavery as a person, but you were affected, indirectly. And you could almost say, as it's compounded and compounded and compounded, the attitudes towards Black people in America when it comes to, a lot of the stereotypes, which are bred out of the fact that they're economically disadvantaged, bred out of the oppression, right? So it's a vicious circle which continues to going. And so your question was, whether should it be to the grandparents of the people who are rich? I believe so, yes, because as much of those people are benefiting now, there's a common misconception. Not a misconception. There's a common, I guess it's a phrasing in which people use in the African American community that, they can't make it unless they're a rapper or they play a sport, right? If they're not an athlete or a rapper, they're not going to be, which is, it's part of the issue. That's part of the problem which becomes dissolved. So I think you would extend it to grandparents or grandchildren and children. But
then Hayden, my question to you then is, then why aren't you doing it for every single person that has, are Black, for example, whether or not their parents or grandparents immigrated here from a different country? Because aren't they still then affected by the racism that exists in terms of skin color perception?
Also, also one more question for you, Hayden. This may not be on a generational scale, but some people that are not African American, white, Asian, Latino, whatever, are affected by their economic standing from when they're born. Their parents, maybe their grandparents were poor, so they can't lift themselves up. Mm-hmm. Why favor the African Americans, even though it's generational and it goes back to the 1700s? Why wouldn't you also help them? Because both on the Blacks and every other minority and white people, they both were born into a poor economic standing. So why are you favoring?
I mean, specifically, if your question is specifically about reparations, then that's a different discussion. Obviously, with my political position anyway, I would be in favor of redistributing wealth down to that level. So that's sort of a different debate. But if we're specifically discussing reparations, the way that you have to think of it is reparation for what? Reparation for the fact that we, as the country of America and our ancestors, committed, a crime against Black people, regardless of their, culture, nationality, or the equivalent of a nationality, you could say tribe, regardless of that, solely based on their skin color, right? And so you can, a lot of people sit here and say, well, my family immigrated from Italy in 1900, we didn't commit slavery. Well, the issue is we committed slavery on the basis of skin color. So we need to repair the damage of slavery on the basis of skin color. And that's the way that it sort of has to be done in order to serve justice. And so your question is, oh, well, why don't we support every minority? Because if someone who's coming from Venezuela immigrates to America, we can have the debate illegally or legally, and they're affected by generational poverty. That's terrible. But it was caused by their experience in Venezuela, not by their experience in the United States. And so slavery and its distinct, you go down the line in the, you can go to mass incarceration and single parent households and due to that and see how that devolves. Slavery is our sin, and it's our sin that needs to be atoned for in a tangible way. So the economic stimulus.
But Hayden, you also obviously have to take that money from somewhere, which if you were talking about the top 1%, taxes like that, or the AI tax, if you want it, were you talking about that going to reparations, like the AI tax that Yang proposed? Was that what you would be in favor of going to?
That's the issue, right? Is
what money do you use to attempt to do that? Is
right. So
because the issue comes about though is if you go through the taxation route rather than necessarily like AI, then are you necessarily taxing people that possibly were affected by generational poverty, not necessarily systemic racism, but generational poverty? Are you targeting them because they have money, even though they weren't necessarily a part of the system that had them, was America that had slavery and had Jim Crow, for example? If it was a wealthy Asian or a wealthy, Latino or someone of that descent, and you're taxing them, and then you're giving that as reparations, how do you determine who?
Can I just quickly jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So on the issue of reparations and on the issue of how will we fund it, how will we be able to figure out who gets what? While I do believe that reparations are a necessity that is needed in order to right our wrongs from centuries of committing one of the most inhumane acts of history, I do believe that the challenges that we will face when it comes to figuring out who is getting the money will be extreme. It's going to be extremely hard to be able to trace back the lineage and trace back the DNA back to someone who was taken as a slave. Now, due to lack of feasibility, while I think that options for slave reparations should be explored, we should also be focusing on how to be able to fix current issues when it comes to the Black population. For example, investing in public transportation within inner cities is essential in order to allow anyone to get to a job. Okay, most people in poverty require public transportation. We saw in Brazil, once they instituted better public transportation systems, they were able to decrease the poverty rate by a few percentage points. Now, the United States is notorious for having a lack of public transportation. So by investing in public infrastructure and public transportation, we'd be able to do that. Additionally, I think that focusing solely on economic method to be able to solve this issue is entirely wrong. We should also be focusing on social issues. For example, having the federal government actually recognize the fact that slavery was something that we did wrong. Like I don't believe that there's an official proclamation. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe there's an official proclamation from the federal government that we committed a sin by doing slavery. In fact, I think the lack of a proper proclamation from the federal government about how the Confederacy was quite literally a treasonous act, and also that slavery was terrible, is currently fueling some of the racism that we're seeing today within our medical system, within economics. So there's a couple of different factors. And once we have the federal government actually recognize these, say something about it, and actually focus on infrastructure to be able to help out the current generation, then we can focus on slave reparations.
I think if I can jump in here, like reparations, I feel like the justice of them and the whole argument of, well, we have to right this wrong, I don't really think there's any fair way of, docking that, because obviously there was a wrong committed and there need to be actions taken to make it right. And with direct redistribution, or excuse me, not redistribution, but reparations, it's like, it's hard to find someone who you can actually charge for these crimes.
True.
And so that's why I feel like you have to spill into some greater form of just leveling the field of opportunity, because as someone who essentially loves the free market, there is inequality of opportunity. And I feel like that's the greatest area of where people have issues, because if people have money, they're going to be a lot more happy, even if they have to face racism. Obviously the racism is still not ideal, but in today's society, the majority of it is like, it's not institutionalized as it once was. And people are very angry because they're living hard lives and they had a harder chance. And I mean, it's just really not fair to expect them to achieve just as much, like Hayden said, with like, if you're a Black person, you have to be an athlete or an artist to actually make money. But I don't think that redistribution is a very effective way of doing so, because I mean, like when you just directly redistribute money, I mean, a lot of people who are low income, they have never been taught how to effectively manage their money, and they might just go ahead and spend a lot of it right away. And I'm not saying like it's
Not all at once.
because
The
it's
reparations
not.
would be a continuous stimulus.
No, I know. So what I am suggesting is, it's called pre-distribution. There's a famous guy who's done a lot of studies. His name is James Heckman.
Mhm.
And my uncle actually I think he helped fund him.
Shout out to Nico's uncle then.
And so basically the main basis of this is you fund a lot of you help develop social emotional skills for kids who are 1 through 5 and up until 18, because there's studies that have been done and it's saying before age 18, roughly 50% of lifetime earnings inequality is determined, like factors before 18. And that's just, if you can affect it, because especially in that 1 through 5 range, you can have the greatest effect. It's such a more efficient way of actually using the funds for good. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's not going to help the people who are over 18 now, but there's not going to be what's the estimate for reparations? It's like $500 million or maybe 500 billion. I think it's an incredibly high number. Odds are that money's not
comparatively to how much we spend on the military, right?
I know, but
if we hold on just for a second, the military can go without 50 extra fighter jets every year so that they can bomb the shit out of brown kids half the world away. They're fine, they're okay. It's gonna work out. And if we could use that money to actually solve the systemic problems which have developed within our society, either economically or with social, programs which contribute to social change, then let's do it. You know what I mean?
No, I know. What I'm saying is direct redistribution is just not that efficient, and it makes, if you have other ways to be more efficient with your money, it's a lot. Because I would be shocked if they got whatever the number is for the reparations, right? I mean, whether or not it's right to get that amount of money, odds are it's not going to happen.
Okay.
So if you can spend less money and try to get an equal effect, which, I mean, the James Heckman, he's done a lot of stuff and a lot of programs. They've been doing it for decades now, and they have seen actual effects that are very positive, like considerably higher than what redistribution would be. I just think that's such a more logical solution, and it's not necessarily like ideal, but it is sort of like what I consider to be pragmatic as far as leveling the field of opportunity, which I mean always ties back into my free market stuff, but I won't blabber on it.
I mean, in a way, my argument is free market in the way that I would like to redistribute off of the top in order to it's trickle up economics.
That's not free market.
Whoa. I know it's not. I know it's not free market, but it wasn't a free market. It wasn't a free market with justice to human rights in slavery when we were gaining free labor off of people, right? That's not free market. And so the idea is that, Black people built this country for no gain, under threat of torture.
I'm not disputing any of that.
Right. And therefore, white people are placed in a position, well, mostly,
Yeah, what I'm saying is just redistribution it's just not very realistic.
I agree.
It's not very efficient.
agree. But my argument is that when we were the most free market, so the inception of America, we weren't actually free market because the only way that it was operating was off of the backs of slaves. So my argument is that,
well, that's one less regulation. It's really a freer market, and then that's not a good free market, but
right. I mean, it's a human rights violation at the cost of the free market, which isn't libertarian in any sense.
No.
We can definitely agree on that. So I see where your argument is supportive of the free market. My argument is that the free market was violated 200 years ago. Let's now
and so that you would
resolve that justice, invest in the bottom, right?
I'm still talking about investing in low income.
I understand, but what I'm saying is give them the money and then let the free market do its work.
Yeah, but like certain people lose money. Like it's not just like there are plenty of people who are born into wealthy families and they squander all of the money. And the reason wealthy families maintain their wealth is because they've figured out how to actually effectively manage their money. And when we're talking about low-income families, they have virtually no experience in how to manage that. But when people actually when their income doesn't just spike, like really just like it's consistent and then boom, it's up. Mm-hmm. When it's a much more gradual change because they're earning more, they're just generally going to manage their money better. And that's why it's so much more effective and so much more efficient to invest in the youth. Okay. The only real problem I personally see is that it's not ideal to just hang out everyone who is over 18 or whatever to dry. But I still think there is no ideal solution that is pragmatic.
I have a problem with any sort of government intervention institutionalizing that, right? Versus I trust under the principles of the free market, once it's redistributed, I trust that it will work itself out, right? And that's sort of, as you know, that's my whole thing as a libertarian socialist. Once you redistribute, it will work itself out through free spending. But go ahead, Nathan.
Okay, so in response to that, I'm more talking about just in general. I think the other problem is it's not just necessarily reparations that are not. It's not just systemic racism that's affecting socioeconomic status of African Americans. I think you also have to look at what's it called, the family unit. I think it's statistically when people grow up with two parents in the household, they're statistically more likely to succeed in life. And I think that's a problem that also has to be addressed within specifically the African American community in terms of how to benefit them.
Yeah.
Specifically, especially due to the fact that before the welfare state expansion, it was only 22%, I believe, of African Americans that only had one parent in the household. And then after the expansion of the welfare state, 75% of or 67% of African Americans grew up without one or other of the parent in the household. And I think that's a problem that also needs to be addressed in terms of benefiting African Americans to help them, improve, status, their status in the economy. I don't think it's just, systemic racism that affects what goes on.
Your mic is kind of.
Yeah, for me it was. Your mic is cutting out, but I really like what you're saying, Nathan and Terry. about the social aspect too. I mean, obviously the crime and the social norms and the one-parent houses are not just, culture norms that need to be fixed. Yes, they are caused by economic status, of course, but we do need to be investing in community centers, in churches, in programs that are helping lift these communities out of all these things, because that's one of how you can fix the crime in minority neighborhoods. That's how you can kind of lift these communities up to want to get on a track of economic status, not by participating in the drug trade and all that. So, I mean, I acknowledge 100% that, all of this is caused by systemic racism and what we've been through in the United States, but there needs to be a considerable amount of work done socially too. So, and then on the economic aspect, I don't think we're really going to agree here. I think, Hayden, you're obviously going to side more towards reparations and redistribution, and then Nico and Nathan are going to go more towards the free market capitalist approach, just because of our political ideologies.
If there's one thing I can add, with the James Heckman guy I was mentioning, a lot of his work has been about how economic and social factors, there is a lot of spillover between them, and how like as Nathan said, the social, how you're raised with if you have one parent or something like that, it affects, if you're more likely to commit crimes. It also affects how much money you're going to make and things like that. And the pre-distribution, as he's coined it, is all about really repairing that and helping just give the kids a decent shot at succeeding. I mean, they're still going to be disadvantaged, but it does show it's a high yield for a low investment, basically. And it repairs a lot of the social damages that a lot of children face in low-income neighborhoods, especially with African American and other minority communities. And that's why I think it's such an equitable solution, because it really does deal with a lot of things. It's just, again, the main problem is it doesn't deal with who's alive right now and who is actually working right now. But
if you guys are ready to transition into more specifically the riots that are currently going on right now, are you guys ready for that?
Maybe we should continue that on the debate tomorrow. Just
okay.
because I feel like that's going to take a really long time.
So should we do something else right now, or should we?
I think we can continue. So I think it's interesting. Ben made a whole point about funding churches, and I have a little bit of a problem with the government funding a religious institution, just on a libertarian sense. But my argument is, if you give people enough money, right? And obviously there's programs and like Nico's saying on how to spend that. But through maybe a generation or two, that money is going to start working toward building churches, right? Communities coming together and funding a church, or related stuff like that, right? So I think we're ignoring the presence of Black people as a whole and what they could do with added money in terms of bringing themselves out of poverty. Because I mean, there's tons of studies. I'll bring them up later. I'll look them up while you guys are talking. There's tons of studies showing that crime rates, regardless of race, in similar bracketed income neighborhoods. If you look at a white neighborhood with the same income bracket as a Black neighborhood, the crime rates are nearly identical across the board, right? So then you start seeing, okay, well, then that means that crime isn't really respective of a culture. It's instead respective of the economic situation in which we have placed them in.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't think many people.
I mean, I don't think the government should necessarily fund churches. I was, talking about how we need to come together. I guess that was too authoritarian and theocratic. But yeah, no, I agree with you, Hayden. I think it should be primarily economic, and we shouldn't be blaming the crime in cities on African American culture. I mean, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, and then also I'd just like to add specifically if we want to talk about benefiting, African Americans in their socioeconomic status. I just looked up a study and it was proven that single motherhood does have a great effect on the future of a socioeconomic status of, the children raised in that household. And just in terms of the household itself, that household is more likely to be in poverty due to single motherhood and what goes on within the family. And I think that's something that the government needs to address in terms of, establishing a family unit in order for, all people in poverty to help them lift themselves up in terms of, looking at the family unit specifically.
Alrighty, well, I think we can cut it here for the first two parts, and we can move on to the third part probably at another date for us, but it will be a separate video on YouTube and maybe Apple Podcasts if we ever get to uploading it there. So next we will be talking about steps forward, the violent protests, or should they be more peaceful, and legislation for police change. All right, guys. Well, thank you for watching the first part.